With over 90% of the world's supply chains disrupted, it's easy to think that procurement's focus should be all about direct spend. But delivering value during these turbulent times from our outsourced service contracts is now more important than ever before. With these categories forming the backbone of our organisations, what levers can we use to deliver more and deliver it right now? Hello, I'm Helen Mackenzie, Principal Advisor at Procurious, and welcome to our webinar, 5 Cost Levers to Pull Right Now with Your Outsourced Services. Today's webinar is designed to give you the practical advice and solutions you'll need to lever in those cost savings to deliver from your outsourced services contracts. And we've brought together a panel of experts with a wealth of experience today to help you do just that. I'm delighted today to welcome back to the webinar hot seat Amy Fong from Everest Group. Amy and her colleagues from Everest Group pitched in early to contribute to our COVID-19 webinar series to provide some great insight for our community into the challenges and current issues in global outsourced services. Amy is a Vice President in Everest Group's Strategic Outsourcing and Vendor Management practice. Now, in this role, she advises enterprises on maximising value from strategic provider relationships in outsourced services categories. Amy has more than 20 years of experience in industry, consulting, and advising with a focus on procurement, supply chain, and organisation effectiveness. Welcome back, Amy.
Thank you, Helen. So nice to be here today.
Joining Amy from the Everest team today is Michael Jansen. Michael is responsible for guiding the practice's research agenda and architecture and aligning its capabilities with the market's disruptive changes and next generation demands. It's also Michael's second appearance on our webinar too. Welcome to the webinar, Michael.
Thank you very much. It's great to be here.
Now, I first met Lorna Brown at a networking event and soon discovered that she's an extremely interesting career. Lorna's an experienced non-executive director and director with a FSIPS pedigree. Her career has included CPO level roles covering procurement, supply management, and supply chain and assurance. Lorna's brief means she has up-to-date knowledge on financial services regulation relating to outsourcing and third parties, as set out by a range of regulatory bodies. Over her career, Lorna's demonstrated a strong track record in transformation, change, and continuous improvement in the private and the public sectors. And she's international experience at senior board levels with financial services both in the UK and US markets over the last 15 years. Welcome to the webinar, Lorna.
Thanks, Helen. It's great to join the Procurious team today and hopefully be able to provide some thought-provoking insight to the challenges faced by leaders in procurement and supplier relationship management. Having been involved in senior roles over the last 20 years, you realise that at times it's a lonely place, and engaging with peers, especially outside your own sector, has been a key part of maintaining my personal resilience.
I agree, and that's true even more now, isn't it?
Yes, Helen. Today's health and economic crisis as a result of coronavirus means that typical approaches to cost management will need careful consideration as businesses' key focus has to be staying in business and keeping employees and customers safe. Timing will be everything.
Absolutely, Laura. And thanks for the great link to get us onto the subject for today's webinar, these 5 levers that we can pull for our outsourced services. Now, Everest Group has done some great research on this subject. Amy, can you tell us a bit more about Everest Group and the research we're going to cover today?
Sure, happy to do that, Helen. Everest Group has been working in the global services space since 1991. We work closely with buyers and with providers of the outsourced services category. So in our research, we cover industry trends, we rate service providers in our peak matrix methodology, we support procurement teams in sourcing and managing their service providers. I personally work closely with CPOs, VMOs, category managers who manage the outsourced services categories. So the research methodology and conversations we have drives a lot of our perspective. We also have a pricing assurance practice where we review contracts against a database to ensure optimal pricing and terms. And through that activity, we start to see a lot of common themes where buyers of services can do a better job. So that's really what drove this webinar topic today. In looking at a lot of that data, I just see a lot of opportunities for procurement organizations here.
Well, that's great. And I mean, before we get into the detail, Michael, I think it'd be useful for our listeners to get an overview of the 5 levers we're going to cover today, if you'd be so kind as to run us through them.
So there's 2 ways to look at this, and when we look at the big picture in optimization of deals and opportunities in the sourcing and services space here. And the first really is to optimize the kind of the baseline cost. It's really around getting a good handle on the deal you have today. So do you have the right benchmarks in terms of rates and the portfolio of skills and solutioning and the contract terms. But we think that in combination with a modernization effort, efforts that are really designed to bring automation, looking to restructure the way you have your relationships and the way you bring your portfolio of requirements to marketplace. And between those two, there's an opportunity to not only maybe talk about a 10 to 20% change, but also potentially upwards of 40 to 60% when you combine the 2 efforts together.
So let's get started. We're going to hit on 5 points today, as it says in the title. The first is going to be paying the right price. We want to make sure market rates and services can be quite dynamic, and understanding the cost drivers of those labor rates is so important. The second is going to be understanding total costs. We know it's never just about rates. There's hidden costs everywhere, and you need to know where to look to get the right TCO. And then we'll talk a little bit about deal structure. There's a lot of different ways to structure an outsourcing engagement. None are right or wrong for every situation, so we'll talk about some of those factors. The fourth one will be innovation, and innovation is becoming a priority in outsourcing as it is in all of our organizations. So we often miss that, though, when we're looking at outsourcing deals. We want to touch on that. And then finally, financial engineering, and Michael's going to talk about how you can find creative ways to fund more productivity in your agreements.
Well, thanks for that overview, both of you. And I think that's given our listeners a good idea of what we've got to come on the webinar today. So time then to jump into those levers and get the advice flowing. Let's start with pricing. Okay, what are the opportunities, Amy, that you're seeing for price improvements?
Pricing is big in services, and pricing is mainly driven by labor rates. This slide shows the most common types of value leakage we see, and in almost every portfolio we review, we see some opportunity to improve terms or to improve price. And this is one area I was particularly surprised by when I moved into the services space. In a lot of other categories, procurement has done so much to get competitive pricing. But in outsourced IT and in business process outsourcing, there's still a lot of low-hanging fruit, I would say, and the fruit is constantly moving. So it's something you've got to stay on top of. Also, in a lot of other categories, it's really hard to find price benchmarks. I used to have people asking me for price benchmarks all the time, and I was like, you've got to do an RFP. And in this case, in outsourcing, there's fewer players to include in an RFP. So you may have 1 or 2 strategic partners and you're not looking to change, but a price benchmarking exercise can be a way to check the pricing and get extremely high payback. So I found that to be a little bit different. If we look at kind of some of the drivers of this volatility, one of them is the volatility of the skill premium. So enterprises continue to pay, premiums for skills that have potentially become more commonly available, especially in IT. Skills that might have been in high demand in the past will soon be in good supply because the talent pool expands. So in a relatively short term, the cost of those skills shifts. For example, if we look at, some of these hot skills that were in demand in the past, we see, SAP, S/4HANA, and maybe enterprise collaboration skills or RPA kind of dropped by 5 to 8 percentage points, and others that are requiring a greater premium now, or gaining a greater premium of 3 to 10 percentage points change. It's interesting that as a skill gets a premium, more people train on it, there's more talent available, and it starts to drop again. So if you are paying, a premium for SAP S/4HANA, you may want to go back and adjust. And the supply changes fast. I joke about this because I have a 10-year-old who's trying to learn new coding languages, and I try to guide him to the ones with the highest premium, knowing that that's probably going to change pretty quickly by the time he's like 12 years old and before he gets out into the market. So, you know, kind of without getting into a lot of the technical aspects of why these changes are happening, you can see the individual resource unit pricing on these slides for a lot of the IT infrastructure is reduced significantly over the last few years. And we see, you know, price per terabyte going down and integrated log source going down. So all of these prices are kind of changing in both the infrastructure and the labor factors that go into your cost model. So there's good news here that, you know, as you start to look at these, you often can find some opportunity. The other thing that we see companies looking at frequently and feeling like they're not getting a good deal on is cost of living adjustment, or COLA. And typically we see people saying that they feel like they may be paying too much. They're not sure if they have the correct index, the best index, and looking at whether it's fair for both parties. And it's very common that these tend to be in favor of the provider instead of more balanced. So, you know, finding the right terms and the right benchmarks and indices for cost of living adjustments is really important as well, because of course that over time is going to drive your labor costs, and in some of these agreements you may be in a 5-year contract, and that COLA is going to change on a frequent basis.
Well, thanks for that, Amy. And you know, this was some really great detail there, explaining the components for our listeners. It sounds like buyers have got a real opportunity here. Lorna, is that something that you've seen happen?
Yes, Helen, I think the key challenge with any outsourcing agreement is really to understand how the supplier is actually delivering the services, and how you really understand the commercial structure. Today's COVID pandemic means buyers need to carefully but quickly plan what approach is appropriate for their supplier. I think the opportunity really is to secure greater cost transparency in the supply base, and that buyers need to seek to understand what their suppliers are currently struggling with, as well as sharing their own company's pain points, because actually right now it might not be just about cost, but about managing delivery risk where services are being delivered outside the home region. But in terms of some of the cost reviews and looking at commercial deals, I think the deals can often be structured at such a high level. Sometimes it's hard to say whether the labour rate that you're paying is the right one, because you can't see it, and you might not even see the skill set. But in some deals where the deals are more transparent and you have a rate card, then potentially, yes, it's easier to do a market review or even look back on the old RFPs that you've done. But Amy makes a great point. The skills change all the time in the market, and you need to stay close to how that is impacting the rates. And therefore, you know, publicly available information in the UK, like the Skills for the Information Age, is often a useful benchmark on some of those skill levels. I think the other thing to watch in outsourcing deals as it becomes to people is key people are often moved from one deliverable to another just because they've got great relationships and that level of understanding of your business. And in turn, it can sometimes mean you pay them more than you would intend to for a market rates role that they're now currently doing. And I guess the final thought on this point is that the risk appetite for offshore delivery can sometimes be a limiting factor for some companies who may have never used that as a labour source in delivering the outsourcing deal, and may not in fact know that they're being provided that way from their suppliers. So in summary, I think you really need to be happy about the overall rates that roll up to the total cost, and being a bit curious and engaging with the supplier to understand how they're delivering the service. Of course, you've no doubt got opportunities to do supplier site visits, maybe on-site reviews, maybe even invoking audit right clauses to see how many people have got working for you. In the digital age, that can be quite difficult. But asking them how many people they have working for you, understanding what you're being billed for, and of course, you need to think about the relationship impact. Imagine starting with telling the supplier you're invoking audit rights in a critical relationship. You might find the relationship dynamic changes for the worse. But right now, just thinking about the pandemic again, I think you may think about the key priorities, and that might actually be looking at alternate sources of supply to either augment or even replace critical supply partners who may be starting to struggle, as well as talking to them about how you may be able to work together and partner differently going forward.
Well, thanks for that, Lorna, and also to Amy for some real opportunities to move those levers in favour of our organisations in terms of costs, but also for both of you positioning those opportunities within the context of reality and the contracts we've got in place and how we might best implement those levers. Okay, let's move on then to lever number 2. And the points we've considered about pricing are interesting, but I wonder, does it go broader than that? Amy, I know you talk a lot about total cost of ownership, because we can call it TCO, and how does that play out here?
It's a great point. I usually like to talk about TCO more than just pure price. So let me say that this next lever around total cost does not negate the first lever or confuse it. Price is certainly important, and getting the right rates for labor is important. But once you've got that right, it's really important to not stop there and to look at all of the other terms that also impact your costs. So if we look at this slide, we see that unit cost is really, probably less than 5% of the total savings potential that we see in these agreements. Service providers have kind of gamed the rate card game on price benchmarking to some extent. So like a balloon, you squeeze it at one end and the air goes somewhere else. So the other things you need to look at are, do you have the right mix of onshore and offshore? And, that may shift for various reasons. It shifts as we move into, say, agile development versus the typical waterfall model. But do we have that right mix, and do we have the right net level of FTEs and the right number of people, and are you driving continuous improvement? And that can drive about 18 to 24% of optimization. We also look at things like automation impact and DevOps impact and self-service impact, where we're actually taking demand out of the model, and that can significantly influence spend. Those are some of those modernizational factors that we'll talk about in a bit, but driving those kinds of initiatives are also very important in reducing total costs. So you really do need to look at the whole picture.
Yeah, so across the big picture, across the range, across the timeline, as well as those component parts then.
Exactly. We need to look at the total cost model, and that includes rates, but it also includes all the other things that we impact our spend. Demand management type tactics that we try to use across all categories are very, very much come into play here.
Okay, Lorna, I'm assuming you've had to deal with some of these considerations in looking at your outsourcing models. Can you tell us a bit more about that?
Yeah, I think any buyer these days will have seen some of the gaming that Amy refers to. Suppliers are very adept at protecting their revenue. And I think over the years, I've come to think that the answer is somewhere at the outset of the deal. Too often businesses and even some buyers get seduced by the promises suppliers make. And I think the saying, if it's too good to be true, then it probably is, springs to mind. When I think about the outset of the deal, often when you're outsourcing, you're not necessarily transferring an internal function to a third party, but actually just buying an outsourced service, whether it's a BPO or an ITO, and in which case you probably don't have "it used to cost me this" as a starting point. And depending on the sector, you may have additional costs to consider, like, for example, VAT in the UK or sales tax in the US. If your business can't recover this tax, you might find that an unexpected additional cost. I think you also need to consider the internal costs when outsourcing. How many people will you need to have in place to oversee the supplier? And depending on the regulatory environment, it might be quite high. I generally talk about this as the cost of control. And in some respect, it's kind of like the level of quality assurance and management oversight that your supplier will build into the cost model and be charging you for, as well as potentially the risk of you putting people into your business to potentially do the same and oversee what your supplier is doing. I think at the end of the day, it all comes down to risk appetite and the relationship with your suppliers to avoid being a victim of their gaming tactics.
I agree. It's really about establishing the right relationship at the onset and at the outset of the relationship. And it's interesting because we at Everest Group work with service providers quite a bit as well. And you might think that they don't like that we do price benchmarking. However, the opinion I've heard generally from many of them is that they'd rather have well-educated customers. They'd rather, in the long run, have somebody start out with, and continuously adjust in the short term than to go through a long relationship and then to have somebody realize that they're not getting a good deal and they need to drastically shift their pricing and possibly go out to RFP. So, certainly helping them deliver smooth services helps when their customers understand what they're actually buying. And I think that's the case in many spend categories. I also agree with Lorna on the internal costs of outsourcing. You move from a team of doers to a team of partner managers, and there's different skills involved. I've been in both roles myself very early in my career, and I think it's something that people often miss when they're planning this or when they're looking at the initial cost model. It's just important to realize that you do need headcount internally that's going to do something different than they did prior to an outsourcing engagement.
Excellent. So we're looking across the lifetime of the deal and also at the internal costs. I like that doers and partner manager metaphor that you put in there, Amy. That's really sums it up well in terms of what people are doing. And so those internal costs of having that element outsourced, and you really need to dig into the detail, as Lorna said, and identify the total cost of ownership here. And doing that, if we do it at the outset, as you both suggested, can really save us a lot of time and a lot of cost and a lot of strife during the lifetime of the contract. So thanks to you both for giving us that comprehensive walkthrough on all the costs. Okay, let's move on to lever 3 now and onto the different models we can use for these outsourcing deals. We've seen in the past many organisations have fallen into the trap of thinking that a managed service model is always better. We've transferred the risk, we don't need that in-house expertise, we can just outsource it. So Michael, time to bring you into the conversation now. What do you typically see as the considerations and even the risks that we should be considering here?
Yes, so it's really about getting the right level of service and really understanding what you really need to have. And so we often find that it's really easy for buyers to say, "Hey, I'd like to have something better, or more prettier and shinier than I had before." And that's certainly going to be possible in most cases. But the challenge with that is there's a price to that. And so if you don't have a realistic expectation of what you're doing today and what you're asking for in the future, you might be in for a fairly rude awakening in terms of the service level implications to the cost structure. And so we encourage anybody that's looking at services to make sure you really right-size that conversation and right-size those metrics. You don't want to be over procuring a higher level of service just because you can. And at the same time, you don't want to be, if you need the service, you need to make sure you're not under procuring it as well. So really important to kind of have a good understanding where you stand today, understand your business requirements for the future, and then adequately and effectively communicate that to your providers and constantly monitor that. So the other part of the conversation goes to really trying to understand what risk and how you're managing the deal. And so, as we move from a conversation around rates and into managed services, there's other things that come into play here. So what are the objectives? Who's managing the risk? What are those characteristics? And so all those things start to come into play when before it was just a time and materials job. And if you move into managed services, you start to take on new dimensions of things that matter into the deal structure. And so one of the things we've done is to look at some of those different levers to be pulled here. And, one of the first things is to look at how homogeneous is the output delivery. If it's one continuous stream of similar transactions, that's going to be very easy to manage, and the success rate is going to be very high as you get efficient and the quality builds in that continuous stream of homogeneous units. But you also need to look at the fluctuations in volumes. And I think over the last few months here, I'm guessing that this has been a real issue in certain sectors and industries where, they've had to scale up for completely unthought of volumes on the upside and potentially on the downside, but probably on the upside for call centers, especially is what we've been hearing about it. So as people have moved from a brick and mortar and move to more e-commerce, so they're looking to change their business plans or change their personal plans, we've heard all kinds of stories about demand is spiking in ways they never thought about. I suspect that over the medium term, there's also going to be some industries where volumes fall. And so it's really easy when you're building the original contract to kind of think in a linear fashion. But when we come to situations like we've encountered over the last few months and probably into the near future, volume extremes are going to become pretty important to have thought out in a more cohesive way. The repeatable high volume transactions, those are going to create more predictability. If I was to understand the historical baseline data availability, that's a critical part to understanding the right pricing structure. And then finally, how much control do you want to give up? And I think this is one of the things that the buyers and service providers have to come together on very early on is, if a buyer wants to tell a service provider exactly how to do it, then the opportunity for creativity or investment in automation and other streamlining techniques is going to be more limited. If they say, hey, listen, I want to just go for results and focus on the outcome or the output, then it's a little bit easier for the service provider to kind of make the investments up front, look at it more holistically and say, hey, we're going to get a return on our investment by making those investments up front. So it goes back to who controls not only the process that's being considered, but the inputs and the outputs that go with that.
Well, thanks for that, Michael. And I like the descriptions that you gave there around that balance between volumes and also around control and that focus on output. And the slides were really useful in terms of helping to illustrate your points. Lorna, what's your take on managed services model? Let's bring you in here because I'm sure you've had some experience with that. And have you had successes with that approach too?
Yeah, I think any company would say they've had successes and they've also learned a lot because I think when you look at managed services and you look at the relative expertise of your managed services provider, or they might be called prime bidder or lead consortium partner, I think you need to be really clear about how they're going to manage that sub-tier supply chain for you. Not just contractually on what terms they'll flow through to subcontracted providers, but what level of oversight they'll provide you with, and the cost premium, of course, for them performing that managed service role. And you saw that in some of Michael's slides where he was talking about that layered on cost. I've seen deals where the lead supplier delivers an excellent level of service and really collaborates with their suppliers. And I've seen deals where the relationship between the lead supplier and the supply chain is pretty transactional and breaks down. And then you've got some tough choices around, do you step in? Do you help them resource? Do you break that supply chain, do something different? I think today, in terms of COVID-19 environments, it's really important that we understand what's going on in that sub-tier supply chain. The greatest risk to some businesses might be in that supply chain somewhere, and they may not have been aware of it until now. I think increasingly boards will be focused on the resilience of the business over customer service impact, and more so than cost. And if you look at many of the tactics employed in the travel and hospitality industries today, they're giving consumers credit towards future use and some incentives or discounts to keep that customer engagement and help cash flow now. I think we need to think very carefully as buyers about beating a cost drum when our suppliers are struggling to stay afloat potentially. Generally speaking, I would say that some of the keys in an outsourced partner relationship that's critical to your business has to be strong relationships, and that's from the exec team down. And not just the theory that you strategically want the same things, because ultimately they want to make a profit and you want to deliver great customer experience. So I think building relationships with some of the smaller suppliers within the supply chain will help you assess whether there are alternates or value opportunities. And sometimes innovation comes lower in the supply chain that might not be being heard by that managed service provider or that lead bidder. So it's important that there's a level of connection into that sub-tier chain. Helen talked earlier in her opening statement about just transfer the risk and it'll be all right. I'm not ever a believer that you can transfer the risk, but I do think you can share the risk with the outsourced partner. And therefore, as you consider reviewing the commercial deal structures, whether it's now because of COVID or just generally as part of a review, I think you need to be considering whether there's enough of a shared incentive or a gain that could form an alternate commercial deal. If right now you're having to help your suppliers through cash flow, then there has to be at some point in the future something potentially that's by way of payback. It's a judgment call. I've not seen a huge appetite for gain share deals in my time, because usually there's a lot of skepticism about the gain share and it being an opportunity for the supplier to earn even more money than it being a real shared gain. I think if your outsourced partner is worried about cash flow today, you might find yourself having to support them, as well as potentially getting ready to augment their services and even being prepared to step in.
Okay, so some interesting points there, Lorna, that are quite relevant to today in terms of that relationship and the managed service provider and the role that they play. And a really good run through the benefits from Lorna and from Michael, and the risks that we need to think about when we determine the right deal structure for our organisation. So thank you very much, both of you, for that. And Lorna mentioned innovation in her last contribution about the supply chain, and that gives us a really good hook to move us into our fourth cost lever, which is innovation. We've heard about some good examples of cost optimisation and what can be done to rein in costs right now. Amy, the other strategy you mentioned was modernisation. Can you tell us more about that? Have you found that modernisation in the form of digital transformation is becoming more of a priority now?
Yes, this certainly is, Helen. When we look at the outsourcing deals over the last few years, we see an increase in the digital components of those deals. So it's becoming quite common to leverage a third party to move to the cloud or to implement RPA or artificial intelligence or cognitive tools. If you just look at this mix of deals or transactions in the outsourcing space from 2017 to 2019, we see a big shift from pure traditional kind of transactional services to digitally focused services. And the mix on the right side of this slide of digital services tends to be things like cloud or analytics, or very commonly automation, intelligent automation tools like RPA, artificial intelligence, and machine learning. So more and more we are finding that this is a priority. In fact, if we ask what the priority is for organizations that are making buying decisions, we see that, and what they're looking for in service providers, we find that innovation has moved up to the top of the list. It's now a given that providers have domain and technical expertise. Say if you're outsourcing procurement, they have domain experience in procurement, right? But it's even more important now that they deliver strategic value in innovative roles, and that's really become a differentiator. So you see this innovation and value addition going from number 4 up to number 1 in 2017 and 2018, and we've seen that continue even in 2019 to 2020 as a very critical priority. I think when we talk about this, something that often comes up that we all need to keep in mind is that innovation is not free. So as Lorna mentioned, we can push on costs, and we should make sure that we're paying the right amount for something like labor costs, or the mix of onshore and offshore roles that we need. But we can't assume that innovation and these digital capabilities are going to be embedded in that We don't want to push on costs so hard that we're stuck in the old processes. And I know that sounds a little conflicting with the first three levers, but it doesn't have to be. So we often suggest calling out innovation and process improvement as a priority, and in some cases even establishing separate innovation funds to use for these improvements. And that brings attention to the improvements. Another factor to consider, I think, when we're looking at digital transformation is that a service provider may be able to leverage the development of next technologies and specialty talent across a number of different clients. So, for example, in the case of procurement technology, I see this quite frequently, it might take quite an investment for a procurement organization and a number of experienced people to implement an AI tool for something like guided buying. But a procurement outsourcing provider may have already piloted that kind of tool. They may have experience in rolling it out. They may have people who can manage it on an ongoing basis. So that may be a more effective way to implement that type of a tool. So I'd like to see more procurement organizations kind of thinking about outsourcing in this way. As we struggle with automation and implementing technology, where can we partner? Is outsourcing or is partnering on certain aspects of our activities a shortcut to building new capabilities instead of just a transactional efficiency play? And I think we'll see more of this in the coming years as we look to cut internal costs, but we realize the need to automate to get there.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, Amy. In terms of reaching out to the marketplace to accelerate your own capability, sometimes organizations may need to be a bit braver than they have been in the past. And that innovation and change is going to be a prerequisite as we come out of the situation we're faced with COVID at the minute. I think as I look at innovation, for me, there always has to be some level of sponsorship and management structure. And I know that sounds a bit crazy, but unless you've got some senior folks in the organisation looking to support new ideas and take things forward from that idea into proof of concept, sometimes the innovation that the suppliers have becomes frustrated because there's never any decisions made or there's never any funding. And I think from my experience, I had a great experience with adopting an agile methodology, and not necessarily agile as in deployment of new technology, but just from basic visualization of ideas to help with the relative prioritization of the most valued ideas and the time to deliver, and empowering the teams to just get on with the ideas that would deliver that value. I also think there's no reason that you can't run a supplier development session. Sounds a grand title, but some level of engagement session with your outsourced partners, and even in conjunction with the sub-tier suppliers, because right now the key criteria has to be how can we achieve the desired outcome quickest. And I think we've had some great examples of that as we go into talk about what's happening right now in the COVID environment. But the most valued ideas, defining what that looks like, whether it's customer journey, internal process re-engineering, might be higher than just cost cutting. And that's moving procurement out of its traditional just save me some money role. I think I touched on what's happening today, certainly within the UK, as we look at COVID. The government's approach has been really interesting as it relates to buying. It's really taken what I think is an open source approach to key things like ventilators, PPE, testing kits, so that we can meet the demand. And in terms of purpose or desired outcome, clearly public health priority has become far greater than the cost of the production. But it will be an interesting case study for all of us as we look back in years to come on the costs for all the alternate sourcing solutions to potentially the traditional sourcing processes that have been undertaken. I think about the Mercedes F1 team, collaborating to provide the ventilators. I'm sure that wouldn't have come about in the normal sourcing practice for such procurement.
We've certainly seen a lot of innovative sourcing and supply chain solutions during this period. And, I think you're right, Lorna. It will be interesting to see how much of that remains when we're out of this phase. And it's something that we've discussed at our Procurious CPO roundtable. So it's definitely a topic that's top of mind. And I love that idea that Amy threw into the mix about procurement organisations getting involved in the innovation and, you know, working with outsourced providers around using some of the tech there. And Lorna, your point about senior sponsorship of the innovative process, I think, is well made and good advice for our listeners. Okay, we're on to our final lever, and that's the potential for services partners to engineer modernisation savings. Michael, let's bring you in and over to you again. Can you explain what we mean by financial engineering?
Well, as a deal maker by heart, that's where I got a lot of my early career, was doing deals. It really goes to the concept of what's in scope and what are we trying to accomplish in the relationship between buyer and service provider. And so we've talked about modernization, we talked about some of the other opportunities in the marketplace, and we tried to put up a simple slide here to really think about different stacks of technology. And in many traditional IT shops, it's really been focusing in on bringing the components together, and we'll assemble them ourselves into whatever we need. So there might be infrastructure stuff that we're going to get around the cloud and the data center. There might be workplace components. Certainly there's a big and expanding area around the applications, and do I build or buy that, and which platform do I use? And then security has become more and more increasingly emphasized as we worry about the security of our data. And so as you look at all these different dimensions, our encouragement is to work with your IT department so that they can kind of reimagine what's possible out there. And so maybe it's not about buying the components one piece at a time, but look at how do I modernize the whole view of the world and say, listen, what I really care about is an overall outcome. And I need to go to the marketplace looking at it very differently. And so as we look at what does that really mean in terms of the building the business case for that, it's a new set of players. We've all heard of these, but it's really how you think about these as they come together. So there's the big tech, those firms that, Salesforce brings you a solution, or Oracle can bring you a solution. There's certainly a new set of players with the hyperscalers, as we call them. Certainly with Amazon and Azure and the Google Cloud and others. And then there's the traditional integrators here. And all of these have a role to play in the building of your solution. And so it's not quite the same as it was a few years ago, where you kind of thought about infrastructure, and then you thought about applications, and then you thought about maybe how do I get labor arbitrage. Then the ecosystem is completely different. And so we have a new set of players. Certainly Wall Street recognizes that. And I think we all kind of know in our heart of hearts the world's different, but you really have to put it together and assemble it and procure it in a very different way. So moving from the who to the how, there is that what we would call collapsing the stack. And so saying, hey, listen, I don't want to necessarily want to buy all these things individually, but I want to get this in a new way, a new dimension. There's a possibility of getting a single invoice, letting somebody pull all these things together in a different way. The immediate savings, there's some subscription economics as you start to think about these in a holistic way. Those are all kinds of the new world, if you will. But in the pure financial re-engineering here, Lorna talked about understanding the risk that you were taking with your service providers and where you'd potentially need to step in to support them. And in other cases, it's going to be just the opposite. The service providers many of them are very well capitalized. Some of these big tech and hyperscalers and the integrators we have on there, they actually have very deep pockets. And it's at times like this when they're going to be willing to invest and potentially help you through the next few years, where you may not have the capital to make some of the changes that we've been discussing today, or that are available in the marketplace. And they're going to be willing to actually roll some of those costs, those modernization costs, into a longer term deal. There's no magic money being created here, but there's certainly some financial re-engineering here that is, maybe they're willing to buy out a shared services or an asset or data center that you may still have, read badge employees, just just provide the funding for transformational efforts, or in some cases create a joint venture depending on the industry situation. But all of those things, I've done many of these kinds of deals over my history, where you're looking at saying, hey, listen, the folks with the deep pockets, they may be willing to work with you in return for, hey, how do we survive the deal together? They need you as an organization. If you're one of their customers, service providers, they need you to be a viable client. They are looking to increase their market share, and they're looking for, total contract values that larger and longer deals in their portfolio as well. So there is a potential to look at this as a win-win. It may not be the optimal cost structure, but if you need capital and you need to get from process or situation A to situation B, you do need to look at these ways as being an effective opportunity in the marketplace.
Well, thanks for sharing that experience, Michael. And there's some really interesting examples there about how people might move forward. And certainly it does make sense for companies that are faced with the need for rapid digital transformation, but who don't have the capital to execute and use that type of model in the current climate. Lorna, does this sound feasible from what you've seen?
Yeah, I think absolutely Michael makes some great points, and I think it goes to the heart of having those what I'll call purposeful conversations, and both with your business, whether it's the CTO and the change teams, but with your strategic partners or with potential future strategic partners to work out how do you not just survive the current business survival mode that many companies are going through, but how do you come out the other side with something that potentially gives you that customer impact and profit impact that you're looking for. And certainly within financial services and the fintech sector, I think there's a trade-off between, is it the big guys or is it the little guys being swallowed up by the big guys? Because the proof of concepts of some of the fintech sectors are actually really brilliant, but they perhaps don't carry the funding and heighten the risk profile so much that you can't afford to take that on. It'll be interesting to see how many acquisitions the big guys make on some of those really creative smaller fintech companies over the months ahead. So I guess in terms of the coronavirus impact, there's a bit for me that says if you have got any headspace capacity right now, I think planning that alternate future on how technology can support how processes could be done differently is use that time wisely. And I think that plays to Amy's earlier point too, around can you accelerate through buying in some of that capacity, whether it's funding or expertise right now. If the vendors are keen, they'll give you that for free advice. Of course, on the carrot, there's a stick always following the carrot, I tend to find, but that's maybe me being skeptical. So I think finally, I think right now, if you're scrambling around in this coronavirus world, trying to pull information as the CPO from all the systems on the suppliers, because you don't have that level of oversight and automation, whether it's the financial risk or the service delivery performance or the sub-tier supply chain, I think potentially now might be a good time to land a few key messages and gain support for that business case on looking at even integrated purchasing and supplier management solutions. Selfishly, procurement's often underinvested in, but with our expanded remits on managing the suppliers, using technology, and some of that's been out there for some time, this is the time to make that case potentially.
Yeah, Lorna, I would just jump in here real quick. I think it's certainly in unconventional times, and it's time to think unconventionally in some cases. And the opportunities are potentially, as we did a webinar recently, we were talking about drifting the curve or powering through the curve. And I think this is the opportunity to be bold, take the opportunity, and look to the future and say, hey, here's what we really need to be, not just for the next 2 months, 4 months, 6 months, but really multiple years down the road, and just take the time. Let's go for it.
Yeah, I absolutely agree, Michael. And I think, sorry, I'm jumping in a wee bit too, and I think, Michael, just to add to the things I've heard from you and Amy today, I think that the words kind of reimagining that future, if you have got capacity, now's the time to think about what that looks like and think about how you can accelerate forward.
And any final words from you, Amy, before I sum up?
No, I think that's a great summary. It is a time to be bold, drift the curve. We're talking to people about how we power through, how we get stronger in these times, so we emerge in the next normal with a better portfolio, better agreements, better relationships, and hopefully further along the digital transformation challenge that we've all been facing. So I think that's a great note to end on.
It certainly is. What a great way for us to end the webinar with this talk of faster modernisation and some inspiration for us to move forward. Okay, listeners, we've covered a great deal of ground in our webinar today. Thanks to our guests. We've looked at how we can ensure we're paying the right price, recognising that market rates and services can be quite dynamic, and why taking the time to understand cost drivers is so important. We've discovered total cost is never just about rates, and there are hidden costs everywhere. We need to know where to look and where to find them. And for any deal structure, we've got a lot of options to choose from these days, and there's no right or wrong answers. And our guests have advised us what we need to think about in terms of what fits a particular situation. And we've seen that innovation is becoming a priority in outsourcing. And finally, we've considered financial engineering and using this as a way we can find creative ways to fund more productivity. And, our guests have thrown down the gauntlet at the end there for us to get that headspace and think creatively about moving forward. So there we have it, the 5 cost levers. And thanks very much to Amy Fong, Michael Jansen and Lorna Brown for being our webinar guests today. You've been listening to the 5 cost levers you can pull right now with your outsourced services. And it's a webinar sponsored by Everest Group and powered by Procurious. Why not head over to Procurious at procurious.com and join in the discussion there. I'll see you over on Procurious. Thanks very much for listening.